Hey everyone, I'm Nick Chaussee, and this is my associate Connor McMahon. We're with Sterling Commercial Real Estate Advisors, and we're here to give you some do's and don'ts of small business leasing with the Small Business Leasing Bootcamp.
So we're here to help, and here's how. Your organization needs an office space, a brick and mortar location, maybe a warehouse. And today we're going to be sharing some education, some local lease rates, terms to know, things to look out for so that you or your organization can sign the very best lease for your organization.
Wait, so what do we do exactly? Well, we facilitate deals between buyers and sellers and lessors of commercial real estate. We'd like to consider ourselves as experts in real estate transactions, so you don't have to be. Same thing with the CPA and taxes or an architect with a house. We help organizations find the right space. But today, this training is meant to prepare you with the terms, rates, and language you'll need to know as you get ready to lease a space.
So because you're here, you are on the hunt, or you're maybe just starting the process. And today we're going to walk you through some things to consider when starting out that process. One of the first things that you are going to want to look at is to really understand what the lease rates are in your local area. And just as an example, we've thrown up some lease rates from the Bozeman market. These are all on a per square foot per year basis. They're going to vary from market to market, so you're going to want to contact a real estate professional and really make sure you understand what your lease rates are in your area that you're looking for space. Another thing to be aware of, the examples here are triple net. As you'll see in parentheses, we have the NNN, which stands for the triple net. And that is going to be an additional rental charge that is your responsibility. And that is going to be you, the tenant's proportional share of the property taxes, the maintenance, and the insurance that is due for that space. So that's something that you're going to want to be aware of, and you're going to want to know from the landlord what that amount is.
So big thing here also is to give yourself time to find the right space. It can be a quite lengthy process, especially depending on the needs of the tenant. If you have specific needs, like for instance a medical lab, you're going to want to plan for 12 or more months. This particular type of space is hard to find and usually has to be built out to meet the tenant's needs. For something a little bit more generic or simple, you're probably going to expect anywhere from 4 to 9 months, lead time. So please don't come to us 2 weeks before your term's up and try and find a new space, because it's going to be tough. So another thing too is to have an open mind. So when you tour a space, you want to go in the daytime and at night and think about what it could be, what your plans for it would be. This is something that's pretty difficult to wrap your head around when you're coming into a blank canvas. Maybe that's in a gray shell condition. That needs a ton of work, or finishing out. It's just have an open mind, and you'll be able to get through the process and think of it kind of like an empty canvas.
And another really important thing to consider is exactly what your size requirements are. You're going to want to understand what the requirement is on a low range and a high range, so you can really narrow down what type of property is going to be the right fit for you. And a lot of things are going to go into determining what the right square footage is for your organization. And the main one is going to be, how many employees do you have, and how many employees do you plan on having? You're going to want to consider what your growth strategy looks like. Many times commercial leases can be very long lease terms, and if you're in a 5 or 7 year lease term and you outgrow your space in 2 years, it can put you in a really difficult position. So you're going to understand what your growth strategy is, and you also don't want to end up with excess space, because paying for rent on that space is just a really poor use of your budget. There's going to be other things to consider, like what your floor plan is going to be, what sort of furnitures, fixtures, equipment you're going to have in there. If you're going to plan ahead for anything like social distancing, These are all things you're going to want to consider and really help you narrow in on a good size range that's going to be the right fit for your organization. And the next thing that's going to be really important when you're first starting off is having a very clear understanding of exactly how that commercial space is going to be used. You're going to want to be really upfront and clear with your broker and the landlord about the intended use. And the reason for that is that many times, especially in multi-tenant shopping centers, there's going to be restrictions on certain uses. Other tenants may have the exclusive right to provide that use or the service in the shopping center. There might be zoning restrictions, parking restrictions. There's going to be a lot of things that dictate whether that's going to be a viable space for your organization. So that's something that you're going to want to understand going into the process and be really upfront with everyone as well.
So wish list and budget. When you start to look for a space, you're definitely going to have a budget in mind, but don't let that budget, or don't compromise, I guess, on key terms like the needs of your employees, public transportation, parking. I mean, that's probably the biggest one is parking, visibility, expansion capability. That all of those things are very important to consider, but don't compromise on those, or don't compromise your budget on these items as well. So prepare financially. Landlords are going to want to make sure that you're not a risk or credit risk, and so you'll need to prepare or expect to have your credit score checked, maybe personally or for the business. Landlords are also going to want to see business reports, P&Ls probably, balance sheet, that sort of thing. Maybe a business plan, especially if you are a new business or if the landlord is going to contribute any sort of tenant improvement allowance. We'll talk about that in a little bit, and maybe even a personal financial statement. These are all things that you're going to want to kind of have in the back of your mind and prepared or anticipate as you move forward with leasing a space.
So once you get into the negotiations, or maybe you've identified a space and things start showing up on paper, you're really going to want to make sure that you understand the fine print. Lease documents are getting longer and longer, and this is where having a good broker or good attorney can really add a lot of value. You're just going to want to understand all of the language in that document. If you're unfamiliar with any terms in there, you're really going to want to understand what those are and what they mean. It's really going to be helpful in case you run into any issues down the road in the middle of your lease term, understanding what your obligations are, what the landlord's obligations are, kind of what's supposed to happen next. Another really important thing is just understand the space as well. Understand the equipment, the build out, understand what's your responsibility and the landlord's responsibility. And having a really clear understanding of all these roles is going to make it a lot easier down the road if any issues do come up. Everything that you may have agreed to in a letter of intent or previous negotiations, right off the bat, you're going to make sure that information is correctly and accurately relayed into your lease agreement.
So to build off of the basics that Connor already mentioned, you really want to make sure that the term is accurate in your lease. You want to have a specific start date, termination date, if that's not the anniversary, as well as the length of the lease. These can get a little confusing sometimes when you incorporate tenant improvements or construction prior to occupancy, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but make sure the term is accurate. Another key point here is you want to make sure that you understand what the base rent is as well as the triple net, and that they are separated, whether that's base rent per square foot annually or monthly. And again, triple net includes property insurance, taxes, and maintenance.
So another really important thing you're going to make sure you understand is who exactly is paying for what. There's going to be a lot of different things you're going to need to consider here. What utilities might be separately metered, and if those are your responsibility. What utilities might be metered to the premise that the landlord is going to pay for and then charge you through triple net. If internet is included or not included. So you're really going to want to make sure you understand all these different charges and where these responsibilities lie. Another good example is snow removal. In this state, we do get a lot of snow, and this is something that we're going to want to, make sure we have an understanding and agreement on before 6 inches of snow shows up. Another really important thing to understand is all the primary or accepted uses of the space. You're going to want to make sure that this is actually clearly written out and defined in your lease agreement so that you don't end up in a conflict down the road with another tenant or in a potential conflict with your landlord. So another really important thing to talk about here are tenant improvement allowances. And this is going to be one of the major negotiating points throughout your letter of intent or your lease agreement negotiations. So to start off, what are TIs? TIs are also called tenant improvements, tenant improvement allowance, tenant allowance, and this is a reimbursement that the landlord is going to provide to their tenant for improvements that the tenant is making to the landlord's property. So a really good example, you move into your suite, maybe you want to replace the carpet, you want to put some new paint up on the walls, maybe you don't like the ceiling grid, you want to add better lighting, you want to put some LED lighting in, maybe it's building out a better restroom or making improvements to make it ADA compatible. These are all things that are going to fall under an improvement category. And you and your landlord will have a predetermined amount of money that they will reimburse for those allowances. They're usually on a per square foot basis. So if you have $10 per square foot, that's the amount of money that the landlord is going to reimburse you for improvements to that space. Just to be clear, this is not for things like furniture or equipment or desks, anything like that. It's just for actual physical improvements to the space.
So another thing to watch out for in a lease is what's called a personal guarantee. These are becoming more and more common as a request from landlords. And essentially, for example, if I signed a lease under my organization's name, I also, as a managing member or a party to the organization, would need to sign a guarantee stating that if for some reason the organization defaulted on the lease during the term, I'm still responsible for the remaining rents to be paid to the landlord. Also, repairs and maintenance are a big one. So typically, landlord will be responsible for the building structure and the systems. However, it is common for tenants to be responsible for maintaining the building systems that are specific to their space or their suite. So, for example, the HVAC that services just your suite, you're probably going to be responsible or could be responsible for maintaining that on a yearly basis, and that'll be outlined in the lease as well. Subordination, attornment, and abandonment. These essentially they get lumped together, but if the ownership of the building or property transfers during your term of the lease, it basically outlines that you have to acknowledge the new owner as your landlord.
So in most lease agreements, there's going to be some language in there about either damage or a destruction clause. And all these is just some language that describes who is responsible for what in case of certain damages. So you'll just want to make sure you understand what's going to be your responsibility and what's going to be your landlord's responsibility in case something happens to the property, whether that be water damage in the bathroom floods or somebody in the parking lot pulls too far forward and hits your storefront. You're just going to want to understand potentially where some of these responsibilities lie. Another question that we get asked a lot is about estoppel certificates. Essentially, all that is a separate certificate or agreement in which you state that there's no other additional side agreements and that anything that is stated in the lease is true, correct, and accurate. These are usually required and become required or important when the property is up for sale. So in the event that happens, the landlord might come to you with a request to sign a estoppel certificate, just so that the third party knows that there's no additional agreements and that everything is as it's stated in the lease. So also in your lease, there's going to be language pertaining to bankruptcy, default, and remedies. In the event of bankruptcy, there's usually going to be a predefined legal process that determines the next steps moving forward. The term default is a pretty wide-ranging term. It just means that you are not following through on the obligations of your lease, whether it be paying rent or something else. And the remedies is essentially just your cure period or the predetermined, pre-agreed on process of which you're going to cure your default. Lastly, there's going to be a surrender clause usually lumped in there as well. And all this states is just what the property or your space should look at once you leave it. Make sure your equipment is removed, walls patched and repaired, carpet cleaned, stuff like that.
So another common thing to have in a lease is what's called a holdover provision. So this basically states that if for some reason the lease goes to month after the term expires, whether or not the tenant has to give notice if it's 30 or 60 days. It'll also outline in this term a provision that the increase in rent that the tenant will be responsible for in that sort of limbo period or holdover. Another thing also to watch out for is a subletting provision. It's really uncommon for landlords to allow subletting. The primary reason behind this is, if the lease starts, or if the lease started 3 years ago and the market has since moved on what market rates are for your space, there might be an opportunity there for the tenant to sublet their space at a higher rate and make money off of the lease. And so typically landlords don't want that to happen, right? They want that money to go to them, and so that's why it's really uncommon for a landlord to allow subletting. So inspection, who can come in the building and when? Typically, or the Montana state law requires that tenants have 24-hour written notice before the landlord can enter into the space. There can be a caveat to that. So, for instance, say that your space houses the boiler for the entire building. If for some reason that the boiler explodes in the middle of the night, there will be a provision that says the landlord can come in and enter the space under those circumstances, if it's flooding or what have you. That's kind of the only other circumstance in which the landlord would enter without giving you notice. Signage. Signage is a good thing to watch out for. Obviously, it's very important to your business and what type of signage you need, whether that's monument signage out front on its own sign, on its own monument essentially, or on the building. There's typically, depending on the municipality, a restriction on how big the signage can be, and different municipalities have different algorithms or equations on how they determine how much signage you can have. So being aware of that and working with the landlord is also very important. Another thing to watch out for is that typically the landlord isn't going to pay for your signage. So that's a budgeted expense that you're going to want to be aware of, and signs are pretty expensive.
Finally, a lease agreement, it is a legally binding agreement. So find someone to review the lease before you sign it. Have your broker take a look at it, have an attorney do a review of it, really make sure you understand once you sign it, because once you do sign that list, you are committed to it. And it can be really challenging to potentially change the terms or negotiate your way out of something that you've already agreed to. Once you sign it, you really lose a lot of your leverage to negotiate or change anything. So please come talk to us, talk to an attorney. It's for brokers working with tenants, it's usually a free service for the tenants. So make sure that's something that gets thoroughly reviewed. So we just like to go over a couple of the things that we see a lot, some of the top 10 leasing do's and don'ts. So just to kind of recap, number one, be realistic about your size requirements. Have a good range there. Make sure it's something that you can grow into, but you're not taking off too much. You want to communicate with the landlord right off the bat about what your intended use is to make sure it fits within the shopping center, the zoning, the CC&Rs. All that kind of stuff. Don't pick a space based off cost alone. You hear location, and it's true. So to make sure to keep a lot of other factors in consideration when looking at this, make sure to read the fine print. Don't rush your decision. These are typically long-term leases. You can be looped into this for a long time, and you want to make sure it's the right fit. You want to be prepared up front. Have your financials, have your business plan. Having these things ready can make the process a lot more fluid, a lot quicker. You want to do work with the broker. This is what we do for a living. We do this all day long, and so it can add a lot of value to you personally. You want to make sure to inspect the property. You want to understand what you're leasing, what's your responsibility, the condition of the mechanical and the utilities and everything that services it. Understand what your rights are as a tenant. You want to understand your default and your remedy terms. Know what happens in a worst case scenario. Maybe kind of think ahead and have a little bit of a plan. And lastly, don't let the first impressions completely dictate your decision. Take some time to understand the property, understand the parking, the visibility, all these sorts of things, and have a really good sense for the property before you make a decision.
As the customary disclaimer, Sterling CRE does not provide any tax or legal or accounting advice. Please consult your CPA, attorney, or accountant for any of those questions. However, do consult a tenant rep broker if you are in a position looking for new commercial space.